Bom dia, caros presentes. Bom dia também aos estimados membros deste painel. Estamos com o primeiro painel da conferência depois da sessão de abertura. E este painel vai tratar dos desafios dos recursos naturais para a transformação estrutural e desenvolvimento de Moçambique. O painel conta com 3 apresentações. A primeira, que vai ser feita por Tarp. Tarp é professor da Universidade de Copenhague, Departamento de Economia e coordenador do grupo de pesquisa em Economia de Desenvolvimento. É ex-diretor da ONU-AIDA desde 2009 a 2018. É um cidadão dinamarquês com uma classificação acadêmica internacional excepcional e um registro de publicações relevantes de política e alto impacto amplamente citado no texto entre pesquisas, política e prática, com base em mais de 40 anos de experiência em mais de 35 países em todo o mundo, especialmente, mas não exclusivamente, na África subsaariana. Isto inclui uma longa lista de funções em Moçambique, durante mais de 4 décadas, inclui bem mais também de 10 anos nos países, atualmente sendo membro da equipe de gestão de programas Crescimento Inclusivo em Moçambique. Tem experiência em vários outros países, além da África subsaariana, e dizer também que tem experiência como membro conselheiro do economista-chefe do Banco de Moçambique. É representante da Universidade da ONU, como membro da equipe de trabalho do Sistema das Nações Unidas na Agenda de Desenvolvimento pós-2015. E é também membro do Conselho Consultivo do Centro de Pesquisas para o Desenvolvimento na Universidade de Bonn. Além do Tarp, nós teremos também neste painel Tony Addison, que é da Universidade de Copenhague, grupo de pesquisa em Economia do Desenvolvimento, é professor do Departamento de Economia da Universidade de Copenhague, é pesquisador sênior, não residente na ONU-AIDA, Helsinki, e ex-economista-chefe da ONU-AIDA. Ex-professor também da Universidade de Manchester, Reino Unido. Temos ainda o terceiro painelista, que é o Patrick Bond, estudou Economia, Finanças e Geografia e recebeu um doutorado da Johns Hopkins Universidade, ou a Universidade de Johns Hopkins, sob a supervisão de David Avery. Isso em 1993. Ele lecionou na Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, na Wheat School of Governance e na University of KwaZulu-Natal School of Development Studies, antes de se mudar para a Escola do Governo da Universidade de Western Cape. Seus livros incluem A Nível em Zimbábue, 1998, Looting Africa, 2006, Politics of Climate Justice, em 2012, e Elite Transition, 2014. A sua filiação institucional atualmente está na Escola de Governo da Universidade de Western Cape, na cidade de Cabo, África do Sul. Estes são os painelistas a quem eu quero saudar, dar as boas-vindas e dizer que as apresentações seguirão-se na ordem da minha apresentação. Muito obrigado. Ao mesmo tempo, a todos os que são participantes deste painel, dizer que ao longo da apresentação, por favor, queiram usar o Q&A para colocar as perguntas que vão sendo formuladas ao longo das apresentações. E não só, mas o chat continua para os comentários gerais. Muito obrigado. Vou convidar, neste momento, ao Tarp para poder proceder à sua apresentação. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute to the IESA conference. This is a great pleasure, and I will try to alert you to existing literature on the topic of relevance, I believe, to the topics of the conference. My presentation has four main components. I'll first say a couple of words about background, very brief. Then I will say something about general context. And then I will move more specifically to a book volume that has been published and which is freely available on the internet for downloading by Oxford University Press, where in particular we focus on three dimensions of the challenge of making mining for change work. One is understanding and managing the boom. The second is the role of the construction sector. And the third is linking into the resource. And then I'll have a few concluding recommendations. During my tenure as director of UNU Wider and in collaboration with lots of good colleagues, one question that struck us back around 2010 and onwards is, why is there so little industry in Africa? And the Mining for Change volume that is promoted as part of this conference is the last step in a major international research program, sometimes referred to as Learning to Compete, L2C. It was carried out by UNU Wider during the period 2010 to 18, among other projects. And I wish here in particular to highlight the project by Addison and Rowe on extractive industries, which I'm sure that Tony will refer to himself. Some examples of outputs from this program are 4 book volumes. I will not here go into the details, but I'd like to stress that they are all freely downloadable from the UNU Wider website. So go to the UNU Wider website and you can freely access all of these book volumes, which range from the Learning to Compete in Industry challenge to the practice of industrial policy. Part of the program, which you can also find on the UNU Wider website, is a major conference on learning to compete, on industrial policy, development and policy in Africa. And you will see here very centrally in this picture, the late governor of the Bank of Tanzania, Benno Ndulu, who contributed a core statement on industrial policy and development in Africa in this conference. His intervention was videoed. I should also thank the moderator and highlight that much of the work that we have been doing specifically in relation to Mozambique has been done with the Director of Economic and Development Policies in the Ministry of Economics and Finance and the Center for Economic and Management Studies at the University of Edouard Mondlane, within the context of the so-called IGM program, supported now by Finland and Norway. Let me now turn to the more sort of professional side of this. The potential for structural change is a key topic in relation to development. And in countries of low levels of income, productivity differences between sectors are large. So this means that the movement of resources from low productivity to high productivity employment can be a driver of growth. And as incomes rise, then productivity differences among sectors and enterprises will tend to converge. Africa has by far the greatest differences in productivity among sectors and therefore the greatest potential for structural change. I won't go into the details. You will be able to study my slides afterwards, but you can see here that Africa has by far the largest sectoral differences in productivity and therefore the largest potential for such transformation to drive growth. But Danny Roderick, the present president of the International Economic Association, has expressed a great pessimism. Industry is not leading growth in Africa. Historically, industry has led the process of structural change, moving workers from the land to industry to employ unskilled workers with higher productivity. And it has played an outsized role in East Asia. When you look here at this graph, you can see the circle around the East Asian countries that have managed very well. But industry has only played a minor role in Africa's growth turnaround. You can see here that even the region's fast-growing economies are all negative outliers. So although structural change is taking place in the region, the pace and pattern has been distinct from the historical experience elsewhere. The structural transformation trajectory has been different, with services as a driver of economic growth, as you can see here on the graph to the right. And despite the evidence that some African countries have grown and diversified over the past 2 decades, growth in manufacturing output has been slow. Moreover, Africa's share of manufacturing GDP is less than half of the average for all developing countries. Per capita manufactured exports are about 10% of the developing country average, and Africa's share of global manufacturing is smaller today than in 1980. So there are 3 changes in the global economy that make industrialization more difficult in Africa. First of all, China and East Asia dominate as manufacturing center. You can see here on the right the high-income countries, and on the left China, and you can see what has happened. Manufacturing as a share of GDP is also falling everywhere on average. You can see from the 1980s to the 1990s to the 2000 to the 2010, the share of manufacturing is falling everywhere on average. There are reasons for that, but let me now move also to the fact that selling to the global market increasingly requires participating in global value chains. You can see here Vietnam and Poland as 2 examples, but most African countries have a lower than average share of global value chains participation. And you can see Mozambique here is not performing worse than other African countries, but on the other hand, it's not doing very well. But there are also opportunities for Africa to exploit. And this volume here, which is also freely downloadable from the wider website, studies industries without smokestacks. Some of the reasons for these new opportunities, and I just tune in on one here, but there are others, but as wages rise in China, they look for new locations for their manufacturing plants. As I say, there are several other reasons, but that is one that will be partly driving what happens in the years to come. Now, an additional opportunity and challenge, the discovery of natural resources, which is in focus in this conference, is that for a growing number of countries, including in particular Mozambique, the discovery of natural resources is an opportunity. But as was already highlighted in the keynote, it is one accompanied by considerable risks. There is an extensive literature linking natural resource dependence to poor economic performance. And one cause is that resource-abundant economies tend to have economic and export structures that are highly concentrated on only few export products. In fact, most of Africa's resource-rich economies experienced increases in export concentration during the first decade and 15 years of the 21st century. Now, the problem is that more diverse economies tend to succeed better in sustaining growth. When you have a very concentrated economy, you don't do so well. So it's important to find out how the revenues and opportunities associated with natural resource discoveries can be better used to support structural change and diversification. And this is exactly what we have done in this Mining for Change volume, addressing the key question: how can natural resources support inclusive growth in Mozambique? And I should highlight that this volume has 3 specific chapters on Mozambique. To answer the question in general in the volume, we address three key areas of public policy: understanding and managing the boom, the role of the construction sector, and linking industry to the resource. And we have not only addressed Mozambique, we have also reviewed and analyzed what happened in Ghana, in Tanzania, in Uganda, and in Zambia for comparative purposes, and also with a view for Mozambique to be able to draw on these lessons. Let me just address four key findings before I go into a little bit of detail, but also to not speak too long. The size of the natural resource revenue is often overestimated, and the delay in receiving revenue underestimated. This leads to a whole series of macroeconomic policy challenges that are critical to performance. A second finding is that proper public expenditure management and systems are essential to ensure that investments yield adequate returns. Third, constraints on domestic construction firms limit local participation in the construction phase of the resource boom. In other words, the potential is not realized. And fourth, while most countries studied succeeding in introducing and enforcing requirements for the employment and gradual skills upgrading of nationals, local procurement regulations have often failed to increase participation by local firms in multinational corporation value chains. Now, let me say a few more details about understanding and managing the boom. The size of the natural resource revenue is, of course, important. And when it comes important, is also, when it comes available, is also important. They're critical questions to politicians and to the public as well. And often these dimensions are not well understood. In Ghana, Mozambique, Tanzania, and Uganda, the size of the natural resource boom has been overestimated, not only by domestic stakeholders, but also by international stakeholders, and the delay in receiving revenues has been grossly underestimated. This leads to critical balance issues in macroeconomic policy. It makes the challenge of steering the economy very, very difficult. Some countries, Ghana and Zambia are outstanding examples, have responded to the news of the forthcoming resource revenues by increasing public expenditure and accumulating debt well ahead of the income coming on stream. One could certainly also add Mozambique to this list, as events since 2015 have clearly shown. So a lack, failure may be a better word, of public expenditure management in these cases has been the lack of effective systems to prioritize and select investment projects, and lack of adequate precision of the recurring costs. Essentially, there hasn't been proper planning for the spending and the timing of revenue. Now, the role of the construction sector is critical in actually reaping the benefits, the potential benefits of resource revenue income. This is so because the construction sector, by making it easier to transform outcomes, is vital in the whole process of economic transformation. But here we discovered that lack of firm capabilities, access to material inputs, skilled labor, and access to finance constrain the ability of domestic construction firms to expand production. And this limits local participation in the construction phase of the resource boom. In some cases, institutional and policy reforms can relieve the constraints on construction. In Ghana, Tanzania, Uganda, and Zambia, for example, policy changes could address urban land rights and delays in planning permission. Again, similar concerns go for Mozambique. In Tanzania, policy restrictions on imports and the performance of the ports can be addressed. And with planning, construction skills can be developed locally. Let me now briefly say a few words about increasing local content. In response to political pressures to localize the benefits of natural resource discoveries, many African governments have adopted a wide range of local content and value addition initiatives. Several countries have, for example, created institutions to guide their local content efforts. However, our research shows that resource extraction multinational companies and their first-tier suppliers often continue to operate almost exclusively with foreign second-tier suppliers. And most local companies are concentrated at the lower end of the natural resources supply chain. This volume on the practice of industrial policy that I already showed you discusses this topic in great detail. And integrating the domestic firms into the resource value chain depends on the ability of the government and the industry to develop an effective public-private partnership. And creating a unit located, for example, within the office of the head of state or government to act as a broker between the multinational companies and domestic firm is one way that has been used to develop this partnership in order to keep this objective of increased local participation in mind. Another dimension of this, of increasing local content, is of course training, but it's very, very important that the government and the resource extracting companies agree on the design of the training and on the qualification process through which a firm achieves approved vendor status. Without such commitment, success is unlikely to occur. So let me now conclude with just a few brief recommendations. I highlighted in relation to the bust before the boom arguments that it is necessary to improve project selection, and for this governments need to build a cadre of economists with training in project appraisal. Having been involved in Mozambique for quite some time, I can confirm that this remains a big challenge. I could explain or could summarize countless examples of projects that were selected without proper reference to socioeconomic development criteria. Adopting a medium-term expenditure framework, as has been ongoing in the case of Mozambique, that incorporates multi-year maintenance plans, can make budget preparation more forward-looking. And this is a process that is underway in Mozambique, and it is critical in ensuring a reasonably stable macroeconomic framework, at least such that you take shocks that may occur into account. And it's very clear that Mozambique, as other governments, should avoid the temptation to relax prudent debt management practices in the face of pressure from domestic constituencies to front-load spending. Now, this is a polite way of saying that great efforts have to be made to avoid getting into debt traps, like what happened with the illegal loans that Mozambique occurred around 2015. There's a great need for institutional and policy reforms. For example, easing the restrictions on movement of skilled artisans can help relieve skills bottlenecks. And government and industry need, as I say, to develop an effective public-private partnership to integrate domestic firms into the resource value chain. And training, I also already referred to. So, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, I'd like to finish this presentation by stressing that I have really only surfaced with a few observations from a relatively large research program on these topics that has taken place over the past 10 years or so. All the results, including the specific country chapters on Mozambique, are freely available from the UNU wider website, as all of this research has been making available freely online, and this is due to the courtesy of the donors that have supported us in making this possible. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope this was useful to the conference. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Professor Fintarp. Muito obrigado, uma vez mais. E gostaria de lembrar a todos os participantes que todos os que estão ligados ao Zoom têm acesso direto à tradução de inglês para português ou português para inglês. Dizer que vamos seguir agora com a apresentação do professor Tony Addison, e gostaria de lembrar a todos os panelistas para, no máximo, podermos usar 15 minutos, que é para podermos ter um bom momento de debate logo a seguir. Professor Tony Addison, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Let me just try and bring up my presentation. Just bringing this up now. Could people just confirm they can see it by giving a thumbs up? Yeah, thank you very much. Good. Okay. So it's a real pleasure to talk to this group today, particularly in these difficult times. I'm going to be talking about the implications of net zero for Mozambique. And I'm going to be talking very much about sort of market conditions and their implications for Mozambique. So to start with, just a little bit of context. We're in a climate crisis. We have to contain average global temperature rise to 1.5 centigrade above the pre-industrial level. On the present trend, we're nowhere near that. We'll probably be at 3 to 5 degrees centigrade increase by the end of the century. And indeed, the extreme climate events across the world recently illustrate probably that we're getting closer even than that. We'll reach net zero when the amount of greenhouse gases, carbon, methane, etc., that we add to the atmosphere is no more than the amount we take away. And there are various goals on that by governments and companies, many of them stretching into the far distant future. So I can say there's probably a lack of urgency on this. This year is a massive year for policy. We obviously have COP26 in Glasgow. We have the recent statement by the European Union, which has been put out for discussion. I particularly flag in that the possibility of a carbon border adjustment pricing or carbon border tax by the EU. And the EU is making a large push on hydrogen. The US administration is pushing on reducing emissions in gas, methane emissions, which is particularly important given the United States is one of the biggest exporters of gas. And just this month, China, or just last month, China introduced a national carbon market, having experimented at a sectoral and regional level, and that will increasingly affect exporters and the whole global market. Even if the Paris targets and the COP26 targets are met, we're going to see more extreme weather events ahead, and those are going to impact particularly on agriculture, food security, and poverty. And I don't need to tell an audience in Mozambique how important that is. We're far short of disbursements on commitments around the climate finance targets. There's a shortfall of at least 20 billion on the target. In any case, the target, the Paris target of 100 billion a year in climate finance should be seen as a floor and not a ceiling. And in addition, aid is under pressure as well, bilateral and multilateral. On the transition to net zero, one of the interesting dimensions of the COVID-19 global recession is it's led investors, private investors, to take a harder look at the oil and gas sector. And in some ways, it's actually accelerated their investments towards renewables, electric vehicles, and so forth. And this is matched by the growth of what we call ESG investing, funds with an environmental, social, and governance mandate, plus central bank concerns over climate risk, particularly the impact of stranding of fossil fuels on global financial markets. And also, as well, I should mention that insurers are becoming increasingly nervous about insuring the fossil fuel sector. So, you know, we have a lot of impetus here, particularly going on from the private sector. If we think about the gas market, and obviously there's a lot of discussion around gas in Mozambique, we pose the question, this is something for participants to reflect on in the conference, is gas an energy bridge to the renewables future, as its proponents argue, or is it a trap, in the sense that it's leading to large investments in the gas sector, which will soon become uneconomic or uncommercial through the rise of alternative energy sources in the renewables sector. Gas prices, as many of you know, are currently very high, reflecting the start of recovery from the pandemic in major economies and a cold winter in the Northern Hemisphere. But producers really need to look at market conditions and prices a decade out. Large-scale renewable investments are underway in solar and wind. A critical dimension of this will be breakthroughs in large-scale energy storage to ensure the stability of the grid and therefore reduce the intermittency of sources from solar and wind. And that will be decisive for gas and coal demand. So we're thinking here of large-scale battery storage, but also pumped hydro and other forms of energy storage. And again, investments in that sector are increasing. If gas really is an energy bridge, there's a question about who supplies it, which is obviously critical for Mozambique. The large and low-cost fields in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia clearly have the advantage. I'm thinking here about Qatar in particular. Saudi Aramco, when it partly privatized last year, made a big feature of its low cost, but also of the low emissions in its gas production. And indeed, the Saudi Arabia and the Gulf countries, such as Qatar, are likely to be the last producers left standing in a shrinking gas market of the future. So the size of Mozambique's Rovuma Basin gas deposits and its proximity to Asian markets do give Mozambique an advantage. But as we all know, Mozambique is already late to the market and some major investment decisions are still pending. And it will face an acceleration of efforts to contain global temperatures to the 1.5 centigrade target. In contrast, new producers such as Papua New Guinea are well ahead, already supplying gas into the Asian market. We know that the majors, in other words, the major multinational companies in oil and gas, are going to consolidate on producers with the best prospects, the best tax and investment terms from their perspective, not necessarily from the government's perspective, and obviously the lowest political risk. Some of you will have seen the International Energy Agency's Net Zero by 2050 report that came out a few months ago. This actually set off a firestorm of debate in the oil and gas sector, because controversially it said that no new gas fields will be required beyond those already being developed if we are to meet the 1.5 centigrade goal. That was a pretty major statement by an international body. And I do urge you to take a look at that report. It received a lot of pushback by producing countries, not least Saudi Arabia, who are extremely nervous about this. If the world does bust through the 2 centigrade target, which was discussed at Paris 6 years ago, then via larger fossil fuel emissions, including from the gas sector, then there's obviously going to be a larger market for gas. But at the same time, there's going to be a larger use of gas, for example, in air conditioning and other means to cope with extreme heat events. For example, the heat dome that we saw in the Northern Hemisphere this year. And I'm speaking from Finland, and I can tell you that the temperature in Finland this summer has been unprecedented, and this is in what is traditionally a cold country. So irrespective of whether Mozambique finds a market for its gas, it's going to have to increasingly put public savings aside to deal with the impact of increasing frequency of extreme weather events, floods, cyclones, and so forth. So in some ways, you can say that the net revenue from gas, but also coal, is thereby reduced as public spending on adaptation and disaster relief in the future will have to increase. So, this is something that governments seldom think about enough because they operate on relatively short timescales because of budgetary pressures. Just continuing on the gas market, as I've said, there are large amounts of uncertainty about whether multinational oil and gas companies will go ahead, but particularly where they will go ahead in the world. They're going to favor the largest and the lowest cost fields and the fields with the lowest emissions. And the Asian countries, which are the biggest buyers of gas, have very large contracts with the Middle Eastern producers. So Mozambique has got to sort of fit itself into this global market structure. All of the multinational majors, oil companies, have strategies for net zero. They're using internal carbon prices to grade prospective projects. And they're increasingly investing in renewable energy, particularly, for example, Total has been a leader in this sector, but also following up by Shell and so forth. Noticeable, Exxon has come under considerable pressure, actually, from investors who basically rebelled about Exxon's neglect of the renewable sector and the net zero target. So the future of the major companies is either going to be turning themselves into renewables companies. And there's a question about whether they'll actually be any good at that. Will they shrink and return capital to investors? So just become more, much smaller companies on listed stock markets? Or in fact, will they delist and get bought out by private companies who are more willing to tolerate the risk? And I say all of this because, Mozambique, like other producers, really does have to keep a close eye on what is happening in the investment world of oil and gas to understand its revenue prospect going forward. And indeed, whether the investment is likely to be forthcoming. Clearly, the multinational companies are going to transfer much of their risk to host governments. They already do, but they're even keener on doing that so that, the government of Mozambique and others will bear more of the fiscal risk than the company. They are very much going to press on the government's revenue share. And there is a danger in all of this that national oil companies will take on too much risk. National oil companies do need a vision about the net zero world and how they're going to adjust and cope with this. Some of the national oil companies, for example, Colombia and so forth, are actually looking to diversify into renewable energy. It's a question whether they are capable of doing that, but they do have the experience of large project delivery. So that's a question for the audience to think about and discuss. There are a series of traps. One is obviously the sovereign debt trap, but also the corporate debt trap, including for the national oil companies. Mozambique's credit rating, as we know, hinges on the LNG gas projects. But also there's a trap around local content, building up too much local content around the oil and gas sector. Well, it can make you vulnerable to actually being stranded, that activity, that industry being stranded alongside the fossil fuel itself. This particularly applies to the oil sector and is an issue for example, Uganda. For any new gas from Mozambique, it's absolutely imperative that it's produced with the lowest possible emissions and preferably be achieved actually net zero through carbon offset and other mechanisms. Asian buyers are already establishing markets for low emissions gas. Singapore, for example, is establishing an LNG net zero hub, and there are already being cargoes shipped to Asia which claim to be net zero through carbon offset, reduced emissions, and so forth. China's new carbon pricing, as I said, is going to have an immense impact because China is the biggest buyer, one of the biggest buyers, next to Japan, and it will favor the lowest emissions imports. And China will do that because it doesn't want carbon intensive energy in its own energy system, because that will affect its manufacturing sector and its ability to export manufacturers with low carbon emissions themselves. So there's going to be a market premium for low emission supply. So it's absolutely vital that if Mozambique is in the gas business, that it's on a lowest emissions schedule or trajectory. How to do that? Cutting methane leakage, flaring and venting. And we have several wider papers on that, which I will put into the chat as we end this presentation. Carbon capture and storage in all oil wells. I'm not sure how much that has been explored for Mozambique, but it's very important. And using taxes to reduce flaring and venting of gas and generally encourage environmental responsibility. Nigeria has actually had some quite considerable success with this, and satellite data is increasingly used to monitor emissions and therefore to tax them, including in Nigeria. Briefly, before I conclude, there are other markets. Obviously, there's the coal market, which is still, unfortunately, quite strong. Coking coal for steel making and so forth. That will still be with us for quite a while because we don't yet have the net zero technologies for steel production rolled out on any large scale. But you can notice there's a move out of coal again by the big multinationals. Rio Tinto was well ahead of the game, selling its TET asset. Anglo American has spun off its coal assets into a separate company. China and Indian companies are investing, but they could get burnt by national commitments on coal use. And indeed, there are now funds to actually buy up coal mines and shut them down as part of ESG investing. Green hydrogen, there's potential using hydropower, and there's been discussion of this in Mozambique. Potentially, you could raise Saudi and Gulf investment on that, but it really would need very, very careful assessment and appraisal. We're talking about billions of dollars investment to make that a reality for a country like Mozambique. Metals I haven't really touched on before, but Finn discussed the mining sector. Very strong demand. Today, you don't want to discover oil and gas, you want to discover cobalt, you want to discover manganese, you want the rare earths, you want the lithium. These are all massively in demand, including for battery storage for renewable energy and infrastructure of the digital economy, which is driving this Zoom meeting today. There's low investment in mining, actually. New mines, they take 10 years to produce on average. We probably are headed for a new cycle, super cycle in metals and mining, and indeed that could derail the net transition itself. Green mining is in vogue, low emissions mining, carbon offset, and so on. So I'll be drawing to conclusions shortly. So there's a market premium in green metals as well. So conclusions, countries including Mozambique need a very thorough risk assessment of their possibilities. The advanced economies, as we know, bear much of the responsibility for the climate emergency and should provide large-scale assistance, but how credible are their promises? Given the remaining global carbon budget, it would be would the world's largest producers be willing to give up their share to make room for Mozambique and other smaller developing countries? We've covered only a very few issues today in this presentation, but if you go to the book that we have wider that Finn mentioned, I'll put that into the chat function on extractive industries, and we have a website about our new project. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony. Muito obrigado, Tony Addison, pela apresentação e pela gestão do tempo. Estamos mesmo a correr com o tempo e vamos seguir com a próxima apresentação. Esta aqui será feita por Patrick Bond, como já apresentamos anteriormente. Chamar ainda atenção a todos os participantes, por favor, queiram colocar as perguntas em Q&A, Questions and Answers. Temos ali o botão para perguntas e respostas e os comentários gerais no chat, que é para facilitar o segmento e as respostas ainda que escritas. Vou assim convidar o nosso próximo preletor, Patrick Bond, para poder disponibilizar a sua apresentação e agradecer ainda que todos os participantes quer no Facebook, quer também no YouTube, possam colocar as suas perguntas, porque temos uma equipa que vai poder copiar as perguntas para poder passar para o painel de discussão. E todos os que estiverem no Zoom podem colocar as perguntas diretamente em Q&A e no chat apenas os comentários. Muito obrigado. Patrick Bond, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Obrigado. Can you hear me okay? Can you give me a thumbs up?
Clearly, thank you.
Okay, I will very quickly handle 4 ethical questions that very much follow from Finn and Tony. And thanks so much for having me, even though it's an all-male panel. It's just great to be with such wonderful people, including the sponsors. So military, this is so crucial today, right? The resource looting problem, the climate debt that some of us in the global north, like me in South Africa, owe to you in Mozambique, and the solidarity systems that we may require, and that requires in turn more voice from Mozambicans, particularly about what happened yesterday. Did some of you see this on your roads? Our invasion of 1,500 troops, that's my tax monies, bringing you some bombs and bullets and boys to kill your citizens on behalf of French oil companies to destroy the climate. This is really serious, isn't it? We have to do something to stop this. And that includes making strong arguments, including economic arguments. Normally, economists have been blind to the climate crisis. And so Tony's work, even though I completely disagree with the strategies associated with marketing, carbon trading, and offsetting, to me, those are so-called false solutions. So we'll have a friendly disagreement there. But it's wonderful that the world's greatest market failure is being addressed. And the typical way to do that is polluter pays. If you're, let's say, a neoliberal economist, you can't disagree that a market imperfection needs to be fixed. And if you believe in market solutions, we'll have a debate about whether carbon markets have been effective. But the critical thing is that if you understand polluter pays, then you acknowledge that there's a climate debt. And that's what Tony put to us, that the North does have an obligation to carry the burden since they caused the crisis. But instead, my bullets and my bombs and my boys going to northern Mozambique are going to confront the Islamic insurgency. So the paper I've presented, which is very long, it's 18,000 words, and you'll have it on your website there, tries to address some of the aspects that bring these problems together, including not just the cyclones, but the droughts that you've experienced. 2019 was such a terrible year that woke us all up to the damage that's going to be done permanently. I'll describe a little bit more of that. But if we think of all the different ways that a resource cursing of Mozambique and South Africa and many countries occurs, there are many dimensions. And I think here we'll look at the elite formation and compradorism that allows your ruling class to invite in companies like Total, ExxonMobil, China National Petroleum Corporation, INI, Sasol, and the geopolitical implications in terms of imperial interests and sub-imperial, South African particularly. I think Rwandans are trying as well with their 1,000 troops there. And I'll also add that there are natural capital wealth depletion implications that I hope Finn and Tony are also on top of. I'm sure they are. They're good economists, and they know that natural capital is a new category over the past 40 years or so that has to be incorporated when you look at the full costs and benefits, as well as the impact of fossil fuel emissions. So without going into the details, since you all know so well the damage being done by these big international oil companies for climate crisis, but also for local damages. These obviously include the geopolitics in Cabo Delgado. The group ACLED is, I think, doing a decent job of monitoring where these problems are. And late March, they really blew up, didn't they, in Palma. And interestingly, the Mozambican army is obviously not capable or is too brutal and corrupt to do a good job there. And so we've seen these 3 mercenary institutions, the Wagner Group from Moscow, Dyke Advisory Group, Rhodesian, self-described Rhodesian leader Lionel Dyke, and then the Paramount Group. And I'll focus on that group for a moment, Ivo Ichikowicz and his training with Burnham International, his new subsidiary, which came out of Iraq and Afghanistan, British imperial mercenary forces. Ichikovic, you should know, has had a really dicey history. And in Malawi, his work there in selling speedy boats and then also an airplane leased actually cost Joyce Banda the presidency there. And you can see from his photographs, he's a very kind of alpha male, white South African kind of guy, typical kind of character here. And you can see his role has been to supply military vehicles and other equipment to some of the hotspots of the world. So a very controversial figure. You really don't want him in your country, I would suggest. And you can look at where tax havens and his various citizenships have taken him on a business day and Financial Mail report. And that's why there is a new movement, I think, of some import in South Africa to question a suicidal SADC military deployment, especially given the role of our mercenaries, given the role of South African state financiers like IDC, the Export Credit Agency, and the need to stop the mercenaries. And also now, as Samantha Hargraves and also from Maputo, Annabella Lemos from Justicia Ambiental have argued that it's really time to address the climate debt South Africa owes as the basically #3 emitter in the world per person per unit of GDP after Kazakhstan and the Czech Republic. Portugal has activists who are also beginning to raise these questions, especially with GALP, and it's good to see that GALP has also, like Total, pulled out. Here in South Africa, we have a Southern Africa People Solidarity Network. It reaches across the region. It's actually headquartered at Zimcot in Zimbabwe. And even a big trade union has expressed its concern, the South African Federation of Trade Unions. Groups like AIDC, ILRIG, Amnesty, Groundworks, Southern Africa Resource Watch, 350.org. These are your solidarity allies. The more you can make very clear that Mozambique doesn't deserve resource cursing through oil and gas and doesn't deserve the climate crisis in the way it's playing out without any compensation. Unfortunately, we do have a sub-imperial military-industrial complex, and our foreign minister is Naledi Pandor, and she testified in Parliament that she's really anxious to get the SANDF into Cabo Delgado because it's a great opportunity for South Africa to import natural gas, and we need to enhance the Mozambicans' capacity. And this is in spite of the concern that South Africa has its own internal war, a civil war in a sense. There have been factions within the ruling party, as I'm sure you all know, with Jacob Zuma's Radical Economic Transformation Group unhappy at his jailing, and with allegations that there were some manipulations. President Ramaphosa calls it a coup attempt, and that meant 25,000 of our SANDF troops were actually deployed during the terrible incidents of looting in which more than 300 people were killed last month, and maybe 20 or 30 billion rand worth of damage was done. So this SANDF came into the streets. They were in the streets of South Africa in April, May, June, July, August last year. Over 80,000 troops and reserves deployed, really to put down the angry victims of the economic lockdown during COVID-19 stage 5. And they didn't do a very good job. They killed people and they were the source of great social conflict and anger. But we've seen the SANDF active in other parts of the region that you should be very aware of, such as the Eastern DRC, where their role in sexual abuse and exploitation, their role in ignoring nearby massacres, their role in essentially shoring up Johannesburg capital, especially Jacob Zuma's nephew, who had a major a $10 billion oil concession given by Joseph Kabila nearby. And this has generated in Eastern DRC quite a bit of resistance. If we move to the other major site of intervention by South Africa in the region over the past decade, that would be tragically the Central African Republic, where 15 of our boys came back in body bags. And what were they doing there? They were betrayed. They weren't there for training or protecting military assets of the Central African Republic, because Francois Bozizé, basically a dictator had made an alliance with both Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma in the prior years. And that meant that there were South African assets, equipment, property, South Africans in Bangui in 2013 in March. And particularly the ruling party, our African National Congress, right, our liberation movement like Frelimo, went really corrupt. And that included their investment arm, Chancellor House, which arranged a diamond monopoly and oil arrangements with Central African Republic ruling class. So this gives you a bit more context, I think, into looking at why the SANDF is not going to necessarily do good work there. And again, Igor Ichikovitz and his Paramount Group come up as one of the kind of key mercenary forces that even Francois Bouzezé wanted to bring in. To sum that up, basically, as Stratfor, so-called private sector version of the CIA, put it, South Africa's had an important role since Cecil Rhodes, right, with its own minerals, energy complex, as it's called. And that role is to maintain a liberal regime to permit free flow of labor and capital to and from the Southern African region, and to maintain a superior security capability able to project into South and Central Africa. So this is one of the dangers that reflects this minerals cursing, a resource looting that if you take seriously, as the World Bank and Conservation International and Ian Kama, the host in 2012 of the Gaborone Declaration, ask us to, if you take seriously the problems the economists have caused by using GDP, gross domestic product, as a measure, it's utterly inadequate to incorporate the kinds of dilemmas, not just the geopolitical and military, but the natural wealth depletion. So what the Gaborone Declaration, which many African countries signed then in 2012 and have been signing, I hope Mozambique joins them, is to force both corporations and state agencies to incorporate the value of natural capital into national accounts. And I'm sure Finn and I'm sure Tony are fully aware of this, and it really should be the first thing you'd say when you're dealing with Africans and natural wealth, which is any comprehensive wealth accounting should give a complete picture of the economic progress. And if you do that comprehensive wealth accounting for most African countries, as the World Bank does, even with some major flaws, we can talk about the details, in their series called The Changing Wealth of Nations and their little green data book, you find quite shocking results. Before I show you them, they're critical not only for Mozambicans today, but for future generations. This is Zimbabwean Finance Minister Bernard Chidzera, working with Gro Harlem Brundtland, argued we really have to be acutely aware of not just the spatial looting of resources, the outflows, not just illicit financial outflows, but natural capital wealth depletion and its geographical implications in a south to north resource extraction system, but also the temporal, the time-related implications. That is, the future generations suffering the loss of their wealth that they should be acquiring. Now, Lumumba Diaping, who I think is the greatest ambassador of Africa on the climate front, he was the 2009 G77 plus China lead negotiator. And he very clearly, with his commission on the rights of future generations, argued this moral obligation. Economists have grappled with it, including John Hartwig, working closely with Robert Solow, the Nobel Prize winner from MIT. And they made the argument that if you do take gas from Cabo Delgado, make sure you invest all profits or rents from those exhaustible, those depleted resources in reproducible capital, such as machines.
Professor Patrick, if you may wrap up in 1 minute. Yeah, please.
I can, yes. Well, what I'll do then is not just focus on the damage being done by resource looting, but instead I'll just flash through, because this is also in our work, to just remind you that these cyclones that hit Cabo Delgado, Kenneth, and that cyclone Ade came through, are anthropomorphic. They are caused by human agency. And Zimcod, I think, put it very well, Center for Natural Resource Governance in Harare, that a climate debt, when Cyclone Ade hit Chimanimani in eastern Zimbabwe, killing hundreds, along with hundreds in Mozambique and in Malawi, rich countries must pay their climate debt to the people. But the government and the minister, finance minister, in Quebec cannot be trusted to manage. So we really need civil society to figure out what would be a climate debt payment system. And my paper really goes into all the details associated with how you would pay your climate debt. I endorse this idea called a basic income grant. Joe Hanlon has written a wonderful book about these cash transfers. There's been, I think, a very effective pilot in Ochivera, Namibia. And then the critical question, can we pay Mozambique to leave the gas underground? And this was the spirit in Yasuni in Ecuador. Now, the project ultimately didn't work because carbon markets got in the way. You can talk about the details, but the German finance minister did something that Greta Thunberg has warned about this year. I'll close with her, which is to not do net zero in a manner that creates new loopholes and so-called pledges based on the cheating tactics like carbon trading that got us into this mess in the first place. We really need to leave the fossil fuels underground and pay the climate debt to make it worthwhile for people in Cabo Delgado and the rest of Mozambique, probably through some sort of basic income grant. We have a couple of groups working this in South Africa, in addition to the ones I've mentioned, a Climate Justice Coalition, a Climate Justice Charter Movement. Really love to hear from all of you, dear friends, colleagues, comrades in Mozambique, what we in South Africa, a sub-imperial military power with fossil fuel interests, what we owe you and how we can pay. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. And thank you, everyone. Muito obrigado, Patrick, e todos os outros demais pelas apresentações. Quero agradecer também as questões colocadas por cada um dos participantes. Temos várias questões, algumas das quais já foram sendo respondidas. Vi que o Patrick Bond esteve, aliás, desculpa, o Tarp esteve a responder várias das perguntas no chat. E agradeço que outras perguntas, sobretudo a última apresentação, também sejam feitas no Q&A. Mas, ainda que algumas perguntas sejam respondidas, eu gostaria de dar ao professor Finn para poder responder algumas oralmente que podem ser do interesse da maioria. Uma das quais, e a primeira, por um anônimo, é o que é que quer dizer por reforma dos direitos de terra? O que é que acha que Moçambique tem que mudar neste respeito? Esta é diretamente para o professor Finn. Fora disso, tem uma pergunta de acompanhamento. Como é que nós podemos ultrapassar os desafios sobre a questão da baixa qualificação do trabalho ou da força do trabalho e como podemos satisfazer, nesse caso, as necessidades da indústria? Eu vou pedir ao professor Finn para poder responder brevemente, enquanto vou depois selecionar as outras perguntas para os demais participantes.
Thank you very much, Michael, and thank you very much for these questions. I'm always at a great temptation to try to speak Portuguese, but in this context, it's probably better that I stick to my English. Regarding land rights, this is a complicated issue in the sense that in many ways, land is plentiful in Mozambique. What, however, is critical in relation to the land rights is that people are not pushed out of areas which have great potential, just like that. They need their rights covered. They need their rights protected in pretty much the same way as Patrick was referring to rights from other debts at the more global level. This is not happening in the way it should. And that's what I refer to when I'm talking about land rights. So it's not just a question of land rights narrowly defined. It's a question of making sure that people who are affected by whichever developments that you are deciding at the national, regional level, that they are appropriately involved in the process, and that in case you do proceed to expropriation of the land, that they receive appropriate, adequate compensation in ways which are well beyond what you typically see. You have seen such cases many other places in the world. India is the case in point. So that's what I was referring to, and that's why I was trying to suggest that these rights are much broader than just referring specifically to land. it's also a right of being included in the development process, which is obviously a core issue here. Because one critical problem with a very narrow natural resource gas-based development is that you're excluding people, unless you really seriously take the challenge of investing the resources that you're gaining from this into local and regional development. And this is not so easy for the reasons that I mentioned, including the capacity of local firms that need to be developed as an integral element of this. When it comes to the qualifications, Mozambique has made big progress since I first arrived in Mozambique in 1980. There were 12 agronomists when I came, first time to Mozambique as a young man. There are now more than 1,400. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that what Mozambique needs to do is that part of this resource needs to seriously be invested in upgrading what sometimes economists refer to as human capital. More broadly, whatever resources below the ground that you decide to pull up, you need to make sure that that is converted into capital above the ground and not just physical capital. It needs to be capital invested in human beings such that they become capable of managing their own lives and playing a critical role in an open, transparent society. So that's sort of what I mean by making sure that you have a broad-based process of involving people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will run for another question, which is for Tony Addison from Fatima Mimbiri. And as we are discussing, I would like to encourage also the panelists to just type some of the answers, because we won't go through all the questions in the Q&A. Desculpa, estava a dizer, por causa do tempo que é curto, eu havia de encorajar a todos os painelistas para irem respondendo algumas das perguntas no Q&A, e vamos pelo menos passar por uma questão por cada um dos painelistas para podermos ter esta breve interação. E a próxima questão vem da Fatima Mimbiri para o professor Tony Addison, e a pergunta que ela coloca é: Tony, existe, primeiro fala da possibilidade de haver ou não disponível informação sobre recursos minerais que podem dar um pouco mais de substância, não é? Ok, que podem dar um pouco mais de substância sobre como eles têm algum impacto no longo prazo para o ambiente, mas a pergunta que coloca a seguir é: o que é que tem a dizer sobre o acesso aos recursos financeiros no contexto da energia ou das mudanças ao nível da energia? Essas são para o Tony, e depois vamos seguir para a outra resposta por parte do Patrick, mas vamos começar pelo Tony e depois vamos para uma resposta do Patrick, por favor. Tony?
Yeah, well, the financing issue is absolutely critical because, you know, as I indicated at the start of the presentation, we're far off the target, the Paris target, and indeed probably the Glasgow target, whatever it will be, for climate finance. And in addition, we've seen a cut in bilateral aid by some of the big donors. Unfortunately, a lot of the finance issues get stuck into separate boxes. You know, you have the climate finance box, you have the aid box, you have the energy poverty box, and so forth. I mean, part of the solution for that is for countries like Mozambique to have a very articulated and clear strategy about exactly what it is that they want to finance, and then to debate that. And that includes actually the investment in natural capital, because I do very strongly agree with Patrick on the importance of forests, fisheries, biodiversity. I mean, these things are going to be much more valuable for Mozambique in the rest of the century than, you know, gas, which is at a high risk of simply being stranded over the next 20 or so years. Again, analytically, economists have had a tendency to put things into separate boxes. But I would actually say that, I think the market approach to policy in the climate world, particularly the use of carbon pricing and carbon taxes, does have a strong role to play. It's not a magic bullet, but it does play a role. And countries like Mozambique themselves both need to take action on that front, because the companies are taking action and the big players like the EU and China are taking action. But also it's for the country's own benefit. If we properly start to price carbon, then we start to see the advantages in more detail and the value of biodiversity as against, say, oil and gas. So, I think that's very important. In terms of courses, and Fatima asks about training and so forth. If you send me an email, I might have some suggestions. The Natural Resource Growth Institute in New York and London does operate a very nice course on oil, gas and mining, which some of you might want to participate in. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tony, for your quick and straight answers. Muito obrigado pela resposta direta e clara. Também temos uma pergunta para o Patrick, talvez diria duas, não uma. A primeira vem do Romão Xavier, que coloca uma pergunta, não sei, não está muito bem clara no final. Diz, como é que nós podemos convencer as elites locais e os políticos para a realidade de deixar a pílula no solo? Não percebi bem, mas acho que é na perspectiva de deixar os recursos no solo, uma vez que estamos a falar de buscar outras alternativas ao financiamento. Mas a segunda, que está relacionada também ao Patrick Bond, é quais são os riscos riscos sobre o pagamento de deixar os combustíveis sólidos ou os combustíveis fósseis no chão, nesse caso na terra, com respeito à nossa situação presente, passada e as experiências do RED. Então, esta vem da Fátima Membiri. Gostaria de dar a oportunidade para o Patrick Bond poder responder a estas perguntas e depois darei 30 segundos para cada um dos participantes fazer um wrap-up, algum aspecto para highlight. Obrigado. Sim, Patrick, the floor is yours.
Well, it's great to start this discussion. I put my email, and I'd love to keep learning from Mozambicans, as I always do, about the dimensions of power and whether you can keep Frelimo elite accountable at some point. How would you change local elite views? Now, I think our South African ruling elite is the most irresponsible. Don't take it from me. PwC does a measure of corporate corruption. And in Sandton, Stellenbosch, Umhlanga, Central Cape Town, our corporates usually rate as the most corporate criminal in the world, according to PwC, a very criminal company. So I trust them on this. It takes one to know one. And I think from that standpoint, it was surprising that our own nationally determined contributions, NDC, statement to the United Nations about cutting emissions this year includes a commitment not to develop Mozambique fossil fuels even further, in Mpumalanga, our coal fields, in exchange for international aid. And Tony's right that the funding isn't in place. Hillary Clinton had promised $100 billion per year if all these countries signed the Copenhagen agreement back in 2009. And what we have to do, I think, is to continue to delegitimize global elites, to push them harder. Greta Thunberg gives us fantastic leadership on that, and continue to say what they're doing isn't adequate. And I think it's in that delegitimization that particularly applies to the claims from Frelimo that it will redistribute resources that are gained from Cabo Delgado gas fields. We know from, just as Carlos said, the military figures who are already out there in Cabo Delgado, they're not redistributing in the ruby mines, in the timber, and in what we know of the gas so far. And that brings me maybe to Finn, because Finn and Tony are as committed to natural capital accounting. And if you do, as the World Bank does, understand that the net negative implications of resource extraction, of non-renewable wealth being depleted, far exceeds all of the positives, the inflows of foreign resources, the royalties and taxes, the employment, the backward-forward linkages, the FDI. If the net uncompensated decline in your wealth as Mozambicans is greater, I hope Finn and Tony agree. They would join me in saying, leave the gas underground. It just doesn't make sense. In future generations, with better technology to extract, for lubricants, for hydrocarbons used in synthetic materials, in plastics, in pharmaceutical products, yes, there will be some important uses of coal and hydrocarbons, but not now, not when it's Total, ExxonMobil, China National Petroleum Corporation, INI, and Sasol. That's by itself, even if it weren't fossil fuels, a convincing argument to leave it underground, to demand the climate debt, and then, as Ruth says, to make sure it does go directly to people, using that Ochevero case as our model for a non-corrupt system of distributing those resources that would flow into the country, in Ochevero's case through German solidarity. And the more our allies in the north work on it, paying the climate debt is the most logical way to do that. Polluter pays. Thanks.
Muito obrigado, Patrick. E obrigado uma vez mais a todos. Dizer para o Abibo Juma, que também é um dos participantes, a sua questão é importante, mas poderá ser respondida num dos outros painéis. É só questão de continuar a acompanhar e voltar a colocar. Então, neste momento, darei a oportunidade, começando pelo professor Finn, 30 segundos para wrap-up, algum aspecto a acrescentar. Depois vamos seguir com o professor Tony e, finalmente, o professor Patrick. Para 30 segundos apenas, wrap up. Finn, please.
Thank you very much, Michael. I believe that in my presentation, I highlighted the need for proper, careful, in-depth analysis of investment opportunities, risks, and potentials. By this, I mean that you need, of course, to have all of the different aspects incorporated in the analysis. And it is for this reason that I highlighted the importance of developing that capacity in Mozambique. It will not be possible in 30 seconds to enter into a deep analysis of what it would need, what it would require to change elite priorities. But it is my view that in Mozambique, the elite will eventually discover that they stand to lose unless they think about inclusive development of the country overall. If not, that will not be neither in their benefit and certainly not to the benefit of the poorest. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tony, please.
I think, one's got to be careful at meetings like this that, I can make an impassioned statement about climate, and I could also make an impassioned statement about, biodiversity and leaving oil and gas in the ground. But, frankly, what I say doesn't actually cut a lot of attention with politicians. Ultimately, the politics of this game are very much to drive politicians, because they want the development revenues. They want to win the next election, to develop oil and gas. But what I do say to politicians is, you've got to really understand the risks. And my view is the risks are very considerable. There's obviously the environmental risk, which Patrick has highlighted, but I've also highlighted the market risk, which is basically, is Asia going to buy the gas, when they can be well supplied from the Gulf and Saudi? And those risks, they kick around the system in all kinds of ways, in nooks and crannies, particularly in the debt position of the government, in the debt position of the national oil company, in the debt positions of companies that are developing an industrial base around oil and gas. This is not just confined to Mozambique. If you look at Uganda with its oil pipeline down to the coast in Tanzania, the Ugandans are betting a massive amount of money on this all working. And then, you know, there's still being a market for their oil in even 10 years' time. So, you know, when I talk to the politicians, I say, do you understand the risks in this game? But also, do you understand the opportunities? Does Mozambique have those valuable minerals that could be developed for the green revolution, for the net zero economy, in ways that didn't hurt communities and didn't hurt the environment? You know, are you convinced that you have those? You know, because as I said earlier, you know, it's cobalt, lithium, manganese, nickel that you want these days. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the presentations and muito obrigado pelas apresentações e pelas respostas aqui dadas. Algumas perguntas não foram respondidas porque não houve tempo. Agradecemos a compreensão e outras foram colocadas em jeito de comentário, sobretudo no chat. Mas eu quero agradecer que continuemos o debate. Acima de tudo, estamos a iniciar um debate que pode ser prolongado durante esta conferência e não só, mas após a conferência o debate pode persistir em várias outras plataformas. Chegamos assim ao final do nosso painel. Quero agradecer aos painelistas pelas brilhantes apresentações e por este tempo de esclarecimento. Agradecer também aos participantes. Chegamos já a 130 participantes na sala Zoom. Não posso precisar o número de participantes no Facebook e também no YouTube que nos acompanham, mas vamos dar sequência ao programa. Vamos fazer um breve intervalo, o máximo de 10 minutos de intervalo para questões técnicas de alternância de painel e depois vamos continuar com o debate. O painel que se segue tem como título Impactos Socioeconômicos da Mineração, e neste caso vamos reparar para questões demográficas, entre outros, e vai ser moderado pelo colega Moisés Ciuta, que é também investigador do IES. Desde já, muito obrigado a todos e convidamos-los a um breve intervalo de 10 minutos e voltamos hoje com mais debate. Muito obrigado.